Hello, Matt. How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks, Dan. And you?
Yeah, good. First of all, can you hear me nice and clearly?
I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. We're joined today by legendary Southampton and England footballer Matt Le Tissier. Matt's reputation on the pitch is already assured. Dubbed Le God by Saints fans, he was recently voted Eurosport's best Premier League player of all time. He's been outspoken during the pandemic, questioning the lockdown measures and calling for informed consent in place of mandates. Critics have labelled him anti-vax and have even accused him of putting lives at risk for his comments. Welcome, Matt. Thanks so much for taking the time to join us. Really appreciate it.
No problem.
If I could just cut to a quick straight from the start, really. Southampton legend, England star, scorer of some of the greatest Premier League goals of all time. That's probably the Matt Le Tissier most people know. So,
Yeah.
Are you also an anti-vaxxer with blood on your hands?
No, I can definitely categorically confirm I am not an anti-vaxxer. I have taken pretty much every other vaccine that's been available to me in my life. It's just this one that I've decided that there wasn't enough safety data, long-term safety data, mid-term safety data for me to want to risk taking it. And that's where I kind of stand. So if declining one vaccine out of all the ones I've been offered in my life makes me an anti-vaxxer, then, well, I mean, you can call me an anti-vaxxer, but clearly I've taken a lot of vaccines in my life, so that means I'm not really an anti-vaxxer.
Of course. And we'll return to these vaccines slightly later. But if I could just take you back to the beginning now. You first spoke out or expressed some concern over the pandemic and restrictions that have been brought into play right back in spring 2020. What made you feel you had to get involved?
I think I was a little bit concerned early on that the measures that were being taken were going to have catastrophic effects on society as a whole. And I felt early on, from what I kind of researched, the doctors that I'd spoken to at that point, I felt early on that the reaction to COVID was an overreaction. And I felt like we had a situation where we were giving so much of a bad reaction to this, when early on the data was pretty clear that the COVID was only ever going to be a massive problem to a small section of society. And I think to take measures that are going to affect pretty much nearly everybody else in society for that, I felt was an overreaction. I thought it was an overreaction to the threat faced, is kind of how I saw it early on. And so I made my feelings known on it. And it's been an interesting couple of years, an interesting social experiment to see how people have reacted to see how the turnaround in the last few months has been quite remarkable, from being probably when I first gave my reservations about the way the government were handling it. I was inundated with probably about 90% of very negative replies. I soon found out what a bot was and how bot farms work, and started to be able to spot pretty easily which were genuine accounts and which weren't on my Twitter feed. And then over these last few months, to see the change and the amount of support that I'm finally getting after all this time has been quite heartening. And I think a lot of people are now starting to question, whether we did respond to this in the right way. We had pandemic plans in place for this kind of situation. And the one question that nobody in the media has really ever asked is, why did we throw those plans out the window and copy what China did? And that has been something that has been incredibly concerning to me, that we've just decided to copy what the Chinese government did. Now, I'm sorry, I don't want to live in a world where my life is dictated to by the government, and unfortunately, the way that the world has been going, or certainly the way a lot of the world has been going, is that there's been far too much government overreach into people's lives, and I don't think it's right.
And I think we'll return to that in a sec, but I think it's interesting you mentioned the reaction to yourself had changed. Back to 2020, you said your only crime had been to question whether this was an overreaction. You also detailed some of the effects it had on you. You said trolls were trying to cancel you, had written to your bosses urging them to fire you, quotes, to try and get me sacked from my job and ruin my life by limiting my income streams. Was that fairly common? And what was the worst example? What was the worst thing that happened to you personally as a result of speaking out, do you think?
Well, obviously I lost my job at Sky. Whether or not they will actually ever admit for it being because of my views on social media is a different conversation. But certainly there were a lot of people writing into Southampton Football Club, where I am the ambassador for the football club, or one of the ambassadors of the football club. So there were people writing into the football club suggesting that the club should sack me because of my views, and it just struck me that there's not a huge amount of tolerance around these last 18 months for anybody who doesn't go with the government narrative, even though now a lot of the information that we know was false, information that were given to the government by Sage, with all their predictions of the doom and gloom, never ever really coming anywhere near to what they were predicting was going to happen. So yeah, it's been an interesting time, and it's certainly been a test of my strength of character and a strength of my beliefs. But here I am 2 years later, and I'm still pretty chirpy, and when my head hits the pillow at night, I sleep very well.
Sure. And you mentioned in the more difficult times, did you still find you had support amongst friends and colleagues, or did you find it very difficult to soldier on, if you like?
I don't think there was a huge amount of support for the stance that I took early on, but that was the stance I took. That's what I believed in. The good thing is, I had friends and family who disagreed with me, but I'm a mature enough person to be able to tolerate other people's views and to not force my views down their throats. And we didn't really fall out over it. I still have some friends of mine who are completely buying into the government narrative, and that's their prerogative. That's fine. That's completely up to them, and that's kind of what I've been championing. Really, is for everybody to have all the information available to them before making any decisions. And I don't believe that we've ever really, for the last 18 months, 2 years, been given all the information that's available. I think you only get a part of the information that's available through the mainstream media, and no opposite views are allowed to be heard. And I don't think that's really a way that a democracy should work.
Of course. Now, you also mentioned that in the last couple of months that's changed. Do you mean the level of support you found for yourself? Do you mean in terms of speaking out has becoming easier? How have you noticed it changed personally? And
I've noticed the replies on my social media, on my Twitter feed. The replies have gone from pretty much 90% negative, 18 months ago, to now being 90 to 95% positive, and people agreeing with me. And it's been quite an incredible turnaround these last few months. So and it's been a fascinating time to be alive. Let's put it that way. It's been a heck of a lesson, and I've along with finding it obviously quite oppressive, being locked down in your house pretty much for 3 months. You find a way to get through that. As a lot of people have done, and you kind of fight for what you believe in. And that's what I've been trying to do.
So just, you said there it's been a heck of a lesson, but earlier you said you sleep well at night. Can I take it you don't regret your decisions? You don't regret speaking out and the cost it's taken on you?
No, if this happened all again, I'd take the same stance, and that's what I believe in. I have no regrets whatsoever. What will be will be. If that was obviously, I was not meant to be working at Sky any longer, and I've found other work, and I'm very happy and content in my life, and yeah, it's been an interesting lesson, but yeah, you're absolutely right. I wouldn't change a thing. I wouldn't change a decision I made.
And to take you back slightly, you mentioned government overreach. Now, one area, there's several, I'm sure, depending on who I'm speaking to, but one area that I've noticed has come under particular criticism was sports, particularly with youngsters, the original banning on outdoor team games, the difficulty even on sitting on park benches and so on. Now, you started out, obviously, as a very talented young footballer. You joined Vale Recreation, I believe, at the age of 7. What do you think would have happened to you had the pandemic struck at that age? Had you had 2 years of this kind of disruption, do you think you could have ever had the career path you enjoyed? Or?
Well, it certainly would have affected my development as a footballer, as it would have affected a lot of young kids. You don't know how much that would have had an effect in terms of it. A lot would depend on what kind of age I was. If you're kind of looking at kind of 13, 14, 15, when, big decisions are being made on whether you're going to be retained by the football club, whether you're going to get an apprenticeship at the football club, those would be crucial years. If you weren't given the proper training, the proper chance to show that you were good enough, then, that could send your life in a completely different direction without any shadow of a doubt. So yeah, I would imagine there's a lot of kids who could possibly have been professional footballers, but because of what's happened, may have lost that opportunity just through no fault of their own.
And on a professional level as well, sport's been a bit of a lightning rod really through the pandemic. I think football was obviously the season was suspended, question marks over whether it came back. I think it was seen as very important for government that it came back for a psychological level and also a sense of some kind of return to normality. We interestingly had Pat Cash on last year, and the tennis players were in the same position. He was saying how hard it was for them, testing bubbles, empty stadiums, almost a semi-lockdown for them. Did you have many dealings with the Premiership during the 2021 season, and how hard was it for the players to come back and play with no crowds, with the new regime? Yeah,
I mean, it was odd to play without any crowds, and it would have been incredibly difficult with all the restrictions and the testing and the bubbles. I also spoke to a good friend of mine who was a golfer who was in a similar situation, who was having to test and travel and do the whole bubble thing, and it really was tough for him mentally, really, really hard, and he did struggle with that. And so I can imagine all the sports that were having to do that would have taken a real toll mentally on those guys who were going through that situation.
But how important do you think it was that sport did return? Were you pleased to see the Premier League, for example, come back when it did?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, we were pleased that it came back because you had something to watch on the television. But by the same token, you just kind of question, well, were the government just using the footballers? Were they using the golfers? Were they using the tennis players just to keep the masses entertained so that they didn't get, too upset about being stuck in their homes? And so it's a bit of a double-sided coin for me. That yes, it was good to see football come back, but there wasn't really anything too normal about watching a football match with no crowd in, because for me, professional sport is made by the crowds that are in the stadium that create the atmosphere. I think it's one of the most special things about the sport of football, that you can play in front of a full stadium, and the atmosphere can be unbelievable in those stadiums created by fans. So when you're watching a game of football, and it is kind of like watching a pre-season friendly, where the intensity isn't quite there. The players' adrenaline levels are nowhere near what they would be if there was a full stadium of people watching it. So it was kind of, when it came back and there was no crowds, it was kind of football light in my eyes watching it.
And it takes me actually onto the next area of discussion, which is vaccines, and fairly controversial area. Again, sports has been in the front line to one degree or another. The most obvious example would probably be Novak Djokovic at the Australian Open. Obviously there to defend his title, wasn't allowed in over a vaccination row. What did you make of the handling of that situation? Were you following it?
I did follow that. Yeah, I thought the Australian government came out of it incredibly poorly. If I'm honest with you, their handling of the situation I thought was incredibly bad, and then pretty much admitting at the end that it was nothing to do with his visa or his vaccination status. It was just that they wanted to teach a lesson to and make sure that the people of Australia didn't think that this was an acceptable way of doing things, and it was just made an example of, really. So I don't think the Australian government came out of that with any credit whatsoever.
Sure. So your sympathy would lie with Novak there, I assume.
Oh, 100%.
And do you fear football maybe going the same way? I think Italy and France have made vaccination compulsory for many outdoor team sports. Do you see the same thing happening over here, or do you think that's not on the cards?
I certainly hope it's not on the cards. And I certainly hope at some point Italy and France have a rethink, because there isn't really any logic to what they're doing there. And in fact, sadly, the situation with the vaccines and making them mandatory for sports people, it's coercing them into taking a vaccine that, and I appreciate the percentage of people that have a bad reaction to it, or the percentage of people that die from it is probably very small. However, there is a small chance that if you take that, you could die. You could have a really bad reaction to it. It could be life-changing. And so whilst that is a small possibility, then I believe that choice should be the thing that people have. You should never be forced into taking a vaccine when there's a chance that it can do that to you. And I've kind of said that from day one, and informed consent is the most important thing. And you should never be forced to take something that could cause you permanent damage. It just doesn't make any sense.
And it's been quite interesting that one of the main areas of pushback, a lot of fairly high-profile sports people have spoken out or expressed misgivings, particularly when it comes to mandates. Why do you think sport has found itself in this area? What do you think it is about elite sportsmen and women who are perhaps more concerned about medications such as this? Why would you say that?
Well, they're incredibly fit people. They've probably got to the stage that they've got to in their careers because they've looked after themselves and they know what's good for them. And they've probably done their research and decided that the benefits don't outweigh the risks in terms of having the vaccine, and that's what every single individual has to be given, that information to be able to weigh up for themselves whether at their age and at their health condition whether it is worth them taking the vaccine. And obviously professional sports people in a very, very small chance of this disease actually causing them real serious issues. And that's probably why, they've decided to speak out about it.
Sure. And another area with vaccines and sports, and one which you have spoken on in the past, is the notion that footballers have been collapsing on the pitch. There has been, the implication has been that it could possibly be linked to the vaccine. Now, I should stress that FIFA has denied any link. It said it's not aware of a rise in episodes of cardiac arrests, and no cases have been flagged in relation to individuals receiving a COVID vaccine. So where do you stand on this now? What's your position on this idea of footballers collapsing?
Well, quite frankly, I take whatever FIFA say with a pinch of salt. They didn't think that Sepp Blatter and Michel Platini were on the take. So, that's an organisation that really doesn't have a huge amount of credibility, to be honest. I've watched and played football for many, many years. And if I, as an untrained eye, as somebody who's just a football enthusiast who watches a lot of football, if I've noticed that there are more and more players going down with issues with their heart in football matches, then they also, if they really truly love the sport and watch it a lot, they would have seen that happen. In 17 years as a professional footballer, I've never had one incident on a football pitch where a player went off the field with issues to do with his heart. And so from what I've seen, this has happened way more than it ever did. There's been some very high profile issues with Fabrice Muamba, with Marc-Vivien Foé. But the reason that you remember those is because they were so few and far between. And yet over the last 12 months, there has been an increase in the amount of players that have collapsed on pitches, on training pitches, and not just footballers. It's been other sports as well. And so the whole point of kind of trying to make people aware, for me, is that surely if me as Joe Public can watch this and notice a difference, then surely the authorities in charge of these organisations, the people in charge of football, so the FA, the Premier League, FIFA, UEFA, even the players' representatives, the PFA, FIFPro, they must also be looking at this and thinking, hang on, this is quite unusual. I think something needs to be done here to find out what is going on, because it might be that COVID, that these players have had COVID and it's caused this issue, and that's what's made them collapsing on pitches. It might be that the vaccine has something to do with it. We don't know. It might be something completely unrelated to COVID and another issue that might be brought up. But we're not going to know about that unless we have a thorough independent investigation by people who have no conflicts of interest, who just want to find out the truth and find out what's going on. Is it COVID? Is it the vaccines? Or is it something completely different that we don't know about yet? And all I'm asking for is that I've noticed that there's a huge difference in what's happening here. Come on, somebody take some kind of responsibility and say, right, we need to nip this in the bud and find out what's going on and try and do something about it. And that's always been my position.
I was going to add the accusation put against you after you said that was that you were putting people's lives at risk by putting them off becoming vaccinated, by the suggestion or the inference that there could be a connection between the vaccine and these vaccine. People would say, in that case, I'm not going to get the vaccine, and that was going to put them more at risk. What do you say to those claims?
So, as I've said all along, everybody needs to be given all the information available, and everybody needs to make their own decision on whether they take the vaccine or not. Informed consent is the most important thing to me, and you could almost level the accusation of putting people's lives at risk by the people who are putting people's lives at risk are the ones that are not giving them all the information that they need to be able to make that decision. So the accusation that's been levelled at me is almost like a projection of the people that are making that accusation to me. Actually, what you're doing is actually probably putting people's lives at risk, because you're not telling them the truth and the whole truth and giving them all the information they need to make a decision. And the best way to deflect away from your guilt is to blame somebody else for actually, that's projection. They're projecting onto me exactly really what they're guilty of. But I won't sit there and say, I'm not going to go and accuse them of having blood on their hands because they're not giving everybody the information, because that would just make me just as bad as them, and I don't want to go down that road.
Yeah. And you've said you don't regret speaking out. You're happy to say what you've said. Are there others in the sport, in football perhaps, in other fields that you mix with, who feel the same way but have felt unable to speak out?
I would imagine, yes, that there are people who are on the same page but who have decided to not say anything because they're perhaps fearful for their jobs. which is completely understandable. I get that. I've just chosen to go down a different route. And, I found that it was more important for me to be true to myself than to shut up and keep quiet just to keep hold of my job. But that's everybody's choice. Again, that's what it all boils down to. Everybody has a choice. Everybody should have a choice. I would prefer it if people would come out and be honest about it. But I also understand if they don't want to do that, and because of the situation that they find themselves in their lives. And at the end of the day, we should all have free will, free choice.
Mm. And it's interesting, you're not alone in the notion of informed consent. There was a piece in the BMJ by Professor David Spiegelhalter and George Davies-Smith where they argued for risk stratification, the idea people could assess the risk on its own merits, assign themselves a certain risk and behave accordingly. They also said that the aim should be to communicate realistic levels of risk as they apply to different groups, not to reassure or frighten, but to allow informed personal decisions in a setting of necessary uncertainty. This is a piece of the BMJ, the views you've expressed yourself. So how much do you think the government should be telling people what to do, and how much do you think should be left to the individual to make up their own decision? I know it's a wide-ranging question, but in these particular circumstances.
I think wherever it is possible, the government need to allow people to make their own decisions once they've given them all the information. And that's been kind of one of my biggest bugbears, has been the lack of a lack of the other side being allowed to speak. Scientists, world-class scientists who are getting censored on social media and not being allowed to speak on mainstream television. And I think it's a terrible path to go down when you start censoring people. We've got this issue now with the online harms bill that's, they're going to try and change the human rights. There's all sorts of stuff going on. We shouldn't really, as people of this country, we shouldn't really have to fight our government so hard to keep our freedoms in place. It shouldn't really. They should be there to serve us and to have our best interests at heart. And I don't believe at the moment that they're doing that.
And some would say, you mentioned social media, some would say the tech companies as well, they've been accused of censorship also. Have you found that's been the case? Have you found many of your problems have come from social media?
I've not been censored on social media. I'm fairly careful in what I say on social media, which in itself tells you the kind of situation that we're in at the moment. But to be honest, I think once you start messing about with people's freedom of speech, even if somebody has got a stupid idea, then I'm sorry, but you should be able to allow people to have stupid ideas. And if their idea is that stupid, you'll be able to debate them and convince everybody that their idea is stupid. And so if that is the situation, then everybody should be allowed to have an opinion on whatever they want. It doesn't mean that their opinion is right or validated, but it's important that everybody is allowed to have an opinion and people are allowed to debate those things. And when you hear both sides of the story, let people make their own minds up as to what they think is right and what they think is not quite right. And that's kind of how we live. Once you start censoring people and starting telling people that, we're going to fine you and put you in prison for misinformation online. Well, hang on a minute. Who's in charge of the right information? Who's the arbiter of the truth in all of this? That's the biggest thing that concerns me, is who's appointing somebody to be the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. Now, I'm sorry, there's nobody in this world that you can put in that position, because not everybody knows everything, and you have to allow debate. And I'm sorry, but once you go down that route, then you are starting to talk about totalitarianism, and that's not a way that you want to go.
a fairly gloomy note to almost end on there, but we started on a more optimistic note where you mentioned the last couple of months you'd seen things turn a little. So I was going to ask you, are you optimistic about the future? And do you think if we were to have the same conversation again in 6 months' time, a year's time, it'd be along the same lines? How do you feel? Are you confident that we could come out of this reasonably?
I would be more optimistic if more countries were kind of heading in the direction that we've headed in over the last few weeks, where we seem to be having a more sensible approach to the situation at the moment. But I look around the world and I see a lot of news from around the world of countries that aren't in the position that we're in at the moment, and I feel for them. I really do, and it does still concern me that there are countries around the world that are still really gripped by terror and governments that are not treating their people very well. You've got the Canadian truckers who are having a peaceful protest, and yet the Canadian government are trying to paint them as some kind of extremists, and that's just simply not the case. So I do worry, and that makes me a little bit pessimistic. But hopefully, we can. Every country can kind of turn things around and try and get back to normality.
Matt Le Tissier, thank you so much for joining us on Sketch Notes. It's been great to have you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
That's lovely. Well, Matt Le Tissier, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you. Sorry, should I say that one again? Matt Le Tissier, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate you joining us, and thank you for taking the time to join us on Sketch Notes. I should probably say that one again, shouldn't I? I can record that. I can record.
Well, let's just do it again for fun.
Okay.
Here we go.